Добрый вечер всем еще раз. Продолжаем нашу серию вебинаров по PBL. Сегодня день 4, завтра день 5. Соберемся с силами, осталось совсем немножко. Долго тянуть не буду, передаю слово Джону, а сам я буду как говорится, на бэкграунде мониторить комментарии и вопросы. John, welcome. Good morning to you. And good evening to all the participants. We're ready to start.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Actually, more. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, it's 7 a.m. where I am right now, and so I am happy to be here. And we are on day 4, and this is a session that I know that some of you have asked questions about, and kept saying, "Wait till Thursday," which is about assessment. Looking at assessment and project-based learning, and explore these ideas. I suspect that you may have lots of questions based upon this, so please feel free to use the chat to ask those questions. Also, again, it's always a reminder that we have this link in the yellow box. This link will take you to the guide that has the readings and videos and resources for your participation. It's preferably it's for watching or reading before each session, but if that's not possible, you can certainly watch or read it right after the session and still get a rich experience from that. And I just added a link at beneath it. This goes to my blog, where we have also information about Caravan of Knowledge. So you've been hearing this week international presenters on various topics that support STEM PBL. And so their resources are here at this link, but then the resources will also be on the main site coming soon. So that's just to provide that information for you. So let's begin with this question here. And so I want you to think, how do you know if someone is listening to you? When you're talking, how do you know that they're listening? And what I'm looking for an answer is, what can you observe as evidence? What do you see or hear that tells you that this person is listening? So take 15 seconds to reflect on that. And I'd like you to post 1 or 2 ideas. What's evidence? So, like, for example, I'll give an easy one. That they're making eye contact with you would be evidence that they are listening to you. All right, 15 seconds begins now. When you're ready, please post your thoughts in the chat box.
So we have some comments here. We understand by them asking questions, by seeing how attentive they are, if they are actively participating in discussion, and the other comments are just repeating the idea. So by their attention, by the questions they ask.
So yeah, so asking questions, definitely that demonstrates listening. Since several people are saying attentive, what does that look like? Because how do we know that means they're listening? What do you see or hear from them that shows you they're being attentive? Like, asking questions is being attentive. Making eye contact is being attentive. What else? Let's break that down further, because that's a bit broad. And please forgive me, there's a reason why I'm pushing on the word choice. We'll all see that coming soon. So I see chatting and commenting. Are they chatting or commenting about what? Because I could chat and comment about the weather. Nurlan, what's this last post, this last 2 posts?
Their interest, they're more interested in the topic, and questions. So the last 2 ones are this.
Okay. This is good. So, and we're going to see there's a reason why I'm pushing back on some of the word choice, because so for example, have you ever been at a meeting? I'm sure everyone has of some sort, where either you were talking or maybe someone else was talking. So they're talking about the topic. They're talking about PBL. And then when they get done talking about PBL, then someone else starts to talk, and they start talking about STEM. Now, in that moment, the person who's just talking about PBL may feel like no one was listening to them because the topic changed. Whereas if the person who talks about STEM were to say, wow, that's really interesting about PBL, you said this and this, and this is how it makes me think about STEM, and then went on to talk about STEM. That would be paraphrasing. So you paraphrase the other person, and then you move on to the next topic or the next, what you want to say. So paraphrasing would be a way of showing understanding, or showing that you're listening. Nodding one's head in agreement is showing listening. Not multitasking, so being what we call body forward, facing the person, would be another example of very specific observable evidence. And evidence is going to be the big theme of today's session, because when we look at evidence in project-based learning for assessments, we have to make sure that what we are communicating to our students is clear, concrete, and observable. Because if it's not, it leaves too much ambiguity. It makes it difficult. Things become vague about what are expectations. So these are our norms. Everyone contributing deeply into everyone's learning. Everyone here uses assessment. So you all have experience, expertise around that. So I am expecting to see you share those either ideas in chat or ask questions. And asking questions could be, to be very specific, could be ones in which you're asking for clarification, for more information, for understanding, or you could be asking questions to challenge some of the things I'm going to be talking about. Both of those would be appropriate questions, types of questions to ask. And so I'm being very specific about that criteria of what is going to be important today. Pay attention to self and others. Some of the things we talk in this topic that I share may be a little bit uncomfortable. You don't have to share out if I talk about some practices that are, so I'm going to talk about some practices that are poor practices. They're not good practices for assessment, especially in PBL. And if you feel like, oh my gosh, I do that, that's okay. You don't have to admit it in the chat, but then just think about it. When I started teaching throughout my teaching career, all the mistakes that I'm going to talk about, I've done them. I will admit to that. I have done them. And through reflection and help from other people, I've learned how to get better at these things. Listen intently with one whole self. Again, some of these topics for some people may feel difficult to hear because it may challenge some of our assumptions about assessment. And all I ask you is just immerse yourself in the conversation, challenge things that you don't quite understand or agree with, or just take it all in. And then you can process and reflect afterward. And the last, of course, is ask questions. This is going to be really important. I see someone posted something they wanted to add.
So the last comment is, if you get the students interested and if you motivate them, and if you announce the objectives reached or the results of their learning. That's what the comment says.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. Okay, and one thing we're going to do is we're going to create a driving question, a challenge statement that they will need to answer by the end of the unit. We explored these different criteria through examples of driving questions to unpack just how carefully worded we have to be when we craft these. An entry event is how we excite our students to see this is not just a classroom activity or a unit, it's just a game called school, but this is going beyond the world of school into the broader, wider world that students are familiar with. And we can do this through videos, role play. Field trips are great if they're done early in the unit and not in the end of the unit. So that students can actually go in with plans of interviewing and gathering evidence from the people who work at the location of the field trip. Guest speakers are great because you can use Zoom or other virtual meeting conferences to have experts participate. Experts are more likely to participate through virtual means than coming in person, because coming in person, as powerful as that experience can be, means they usually have to give up half or the whole day of work, and they can't always afford to do that. But if you only need them for 15 or 20 minutes, then they can, call into Zoom and participate that way. And that's something they can work in their schedule. So you'll have more opportunities to do virtual communication. In fact, you'll be able to talk to not just people locally, but people across Kazakhstan, as well as internationally. And like I said, this is an example of a video that can be used as a launch to a discussion about how do we, combat the flu season, or how do we make sure we don't spread any infectious diseases and find solutions to that. All right, so of those ideas from before that we've looked at, which one do you feel is new or important for you to spend time on when you move forward? Please post your answers in the chat box. Let's take first 10 seconds to reflect on this question before you post your answers. Okay, when you're ready, please post your answer. So as you think about your answer, and then I'd like to see some ideas posted so I can see what you're thinking. Make sure we're all on the same pathway, because what we're about to jump into with assessments, it's going to be important that we're all having the same understanding. But I shared in a previous webinar session about some studies done where we call it teachers were asked the question, how long, or not asked the question, they were observed in terms of when a teacher asks a question, how long do they pause before responding? And I've looked at a couple of different studies from 1970s up into the early 2000s, and they came out with pretty much with the same answer, which was 0.9 seconds. The teachers tend to pause for just less than 1 second before talking again. And if you think about that, that doesn't give students time, it gives learners time to answer, because there's a lot of learners need time to process, to reflect, and think about what they've just seen and make sense of it. And so they found those studies, if you wait 3 seconds, you got significantly more involvement. But wait time usually is good to wait anywhere from 5 to 20 seconds. Give students time to really process and think about it, so that then you don't have to ask for volunteers, you can call up volunteers. And if it's think time where they don't quite have the answer and you need more time to kind of make sense of it, you're pausing for anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 to 3 minutes is good. And that could be talk to a partner, it could be journaling, it could be silent reflection. But the big picture is that if we're only pausing for less than 1 second, we're not teaching students adequately how to reflect, because we're not giving them the time. And part of that is, as teachers, we have to become comfortable with silence. So those are things to think about when go back to the whole idea of listening. What's observable in terms of that? So let's talk about assessment. First and foremost, the biggest question that always comes up is, what about traditional assessments? What about those quizzes, those tests, those essays? Can you do those in a PBL unit? And when I get that question, I always respond with a question, which is, in a high quality traditional unit, what assessments do you use that really works? And people will say, well, I've got these really good quizzes and tests. We've got common assessments. There's these rubrics we use that are very clear and strong. And then my answer is, well, then that's what you would use in project-based learning. PBL will use those traditional assessments. They're part of the work of PBL. So it's not that we're not going to do quizzes because that's traditional. If the quizzes are good and timely, and the intent is for formative understanding and not just punishment or putting grades in a grade book, then that can be very helpful for how we manage and monitor what student learning is. So if you have good assessments you currently use, you will continue to use those in PBL. As I continue, anytime if you have a question or comment, please post as we think about these ideas. Now, with that said, in PBL, there are some things that are done differently than in a traditional unit, and that's what we want to explore. So as I said, these types of traditional tools you would continue to use, and there's many more types of assessments that can be very effective if used in the right way and right timing. They can be very useful, and you would continue to use these throughout a PBL unit. For example, you want to do formative checks at least once or twice a week during a PBL unit. And those formative assessment checks are going to be based upon what is the specific skills or concepts that you are tracking growth in students during that week. Because you don't want to wait 2 weeks only to find out that half of your students are still stuck in week one's content. They don't even understand that content, so they're that far behind. So doing formative assessment checks at least once or twice, preferably twice a week, is really important. And that's true whether you're doing a PBL unit or a traditional unit. So, as I said, now, one of the questions always comes is, how often should we do informative checks? Like informally, how should we be checking in to see, how students are progressing? And the answer is daily. Now, that might seem like a lot, but the reality is this is what teachers do already. And they might do it without thinking about it. And we just want to formalize it so it's much more intentional in what our practice is. Because every day when you're teaching a lesson, you can observe, you can notice where if students are completing assignments or they're falling behind. Yeah, and if they're falling behind, then that's data. Now we need cleaner data, so you need to do some type of formal assessment check, some type of quiz or exit ticket or something that are even conversations to learn more about what's happening in that situation. But we already do that. And so doing this frequently and checking in daily around that is important to have some type of formal way of documenting what their progress. And that doesn't mean that every day you put something in the grade book. That would drive you crazy with the paperwork. And that wouldn't be fair to students either if you're putting points in the grade book every day, because that's not the intent of doing daily formative checks. You might have a checklist, or you might have you might do a quiz that's an ungraded quiz. You're just trying to see where they are. Are you using exit tickets, exit cards to check? You might be using some type of online like Quizlets or Nearpod to do some assessment checks. And then you don't record that. You just look at it, decide what you need to do based on the data that it's given you, and then you move on. So that's a key thing about these types of assessments. I want to give you an example. Now, in this example, this is an actual assignment that was given to a class in the United States. It's US history. And it's okay if you don't know US history, you can still evaluate this test. So what happened was this student, completed this task, this assignment. And the assignment was they had to label the names of the states, the names of important cities, and also the names of important bodies of water and landmarks. So that's what the students had to do. Now, this student got an 80% on this assessment. So what do you think? What does 80% mean to you? When a student gets 80% out of 100, what does that mean about their knowledge? What is their level of understanding? In your expert opinion, when a student gets an 80 out of 100 or an 8 out of 10, share your thoughts in the chat. Could be in science, it could be in math, it could be in a class in Russian language. Again, 80% out of 100. What does that mean in terms of their knowledge? Is it really good? Is it adequate? Okay, so their knowledge is more than half. Okay.
There is another comment which says it means the learning target has been acquired.
Okay, so the learning target's been acquired.
In our school, where I used to work, it meant almost perfect score.
Okay, okay. Well, there's a 20% gap, but the student's probably doing pretty good, right? So they got 80%. They seem to know a lot of the topic, so that's a good thing. You know, at the same time, then as a teacher, we need to ask the question. All right, but 80% is not perfect. There's a 20% gap. So what is that gap? Is it something that's significant? That's important? It might be minor. We don't know. But that would be our next question: is what is the gap? You know, just remember, every student deserves a year's plus growth. So even your above average or advanced kids deserve a year's growth. This student has a small gap. What is that gap? So when we look closer at this assessment to determine what is the gap, here's what we find out. We find out that based upon this assignment, you know, which asks, you need to label all the states correctly. The student did label the states correctly. Did you label all the capitals and cities correctly? This student labeled all of those correctly. And the last expectation was, did you label the geographical landmarks correctly? The student labeled each geographical landmark correctly. So all the things that the task asked them to do around content, the student did correctly. In fact, the student would have a perfect score. So what questions might you have at that point? You know, and I can imagine, you know, basically why? And why is it 80%? Why did they lose points? What was about this assessment that they were missing if they got everything that was supposed to be assessed perfect? Well, here's the reason why this student lost points. I said this is an actual assignment. It was taken off because two reasons. One was spelling. Now, this is a social studies or history assignment. This is not an English assignment. So they lost points for something that's not assessed in the history class. They're also taking off points because if you look at the top, the list of three categories, you'll see at the top of each category, red, green, and black. They're supposed to list the states in red, the cities in green, and then the landmarks in black. So yeah, color test. So basic I can promise you that there are in the history standards for this area, there's no standard or outcome about color. So what happened was the student lost 20% of the points because they didn't follow all the directions. Now, here's the thing. I think we all can agree that following directions is important, right? Because, you know, in life, you got to follow directions. Believe me, the work I do with adults in different areas, it comes up all the time where people don't follow the directions, and then it just takes longer for them to get what they need because they just didn't follow directions in front of them. So following directions is a valuable skill, but that's not a skill that's being assessed in this, or shouldn't be assessed for history. And so what happens here is because points were taken off, there's this illusion, there's 80%, there's this illusion that this student has a 20% gap in knowledge around history because of the score that the student got. And that's what we call assessment fog. And assessment fog is when when a test or assessment is supposed to collect data on one thing, but ends up collecting data on other things that are in contradiction or in conflict of our primary purpose. So again, if some of you are feeling like, wait, but she didn't follow directions, there should be a penalty. Well, it's not that there should be a penalty. The student needs some coaching on how to follow directions, absolutely. But that should be a separate, that's separate feedback. And if you're going to take off points for that, then that should be a separate category called following directions. But those points should not be taken off for the history assignment. In fact, that history grade should not be an 80%. It should be 100% under social studies. And maybe it's a 60% in following directions if such a column exists. If that column does not exist, then no points are given or taken for that. That just becomes comments and conversation that the teacher has with the students. All right, so let's move on. And as I said, if there's, let me see, we have here in our school, it's customary to use task descriptors. The students must know what is being addressed and how it's assessed, which you will receive points. Good, that's great, because that's an important clarity that needs to happen. As we move on, I would like all of you to, the idea here is this. I'm just sharing with you information, and I want you to make your own assessment about what you already do well and what are some possible areas to reflect on practice to make changes. You don't have to admit to anything on this to me. If you have questions, ask them. I really want you to ask them. So in project-based learning, we have students working individually and working in groups. And when it comes to assessment, what we want to do is group assessments could be around the global professional skills, like the 4 C's, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity, and other things like perseverance, following directions. Those could be appropriate ways of doing group assessments. Academic assessments should be individual. In fact, there should never, ever be a group grade for an academic topic. I'll give you an example. And please know, like I said this to you at the very beginning, these are all mistakes that I too have made in the past in my career. So I'm not, throwing stones in a glass house. I'm being very clear and honest about this too. I can't speak for you, but I know I have done these things. Here's the thing. So let's say we're teaching math or science. And we're teaching, really important skills that students need to know. And they're working in a group on that. And then at the end, they have to produce an experiment and a presentation, as well as a report about that. Okay. Now, in that group, what if some of the students are doing no work or far less work than other students? So let's say it's a group of 4. One's not doing any work, one's doing a little work, but not much, and the other 2 have divided up the work. And as a result of the work is such high quality that you give the work an A. And since they worked as a group, or rather because they're in a group, everyone earned an A. That creates assessment fog, because 2 of those students truly don't have the knowledge and understanding of those science concepts because they didn't do anything, or they did very little, but they got the A anyway, and that creates assessment fog, because according to your grade book, an A means those 2 students have mastery understanding of those concepts, when the reality is they don't. And then of the other 2 students, do they really have mastery level content? Because if they divided the work, then they were only working on half each on half of the content, the concepts. So they might not have, they have better understanding with the first two students, but they might not have full understanding separately. So it's important instead when they work in a group that they do the experiments, they have conversations, kind of like a study group, they have these conversations. And then when it comes time to write the science report, they each write their own report. So they got to collaborate on ideas and do the experiments, and they can share the notes if they participated. But ultimately, they have to write their own report to show their understanding. That would be an individual assessment. All academic assessments must be individual. Here's another reason why for this. Do you ever have students who say, I don't want to work in groups? I'll tell you, the most predominant reason they don't want to work in groups is because they don't want to work with other students who don't have the work ethic that they have, or who will put in the full effort that they're going to do, because they feel like, why, I might as well do the work myself if I want to make sure I get a good grade. I don't want to depend on my peers because I've seen in past experience that my peers have not stepped up. And so that's why they say they don't want to work in groups. And so if you eliminate the group grade for academics, let them work in groups. That's very powerful to develop 21st century skills, global professional skills. But the assessments for content should be individual. So think about that. If you have any questions or if you agree, either way, or disagree, just post, because this is where we think about our norms. I want you to feel like you come out with a clear understanding of this. So, let's look at this as a way to break it up. Okay, this is another example. So let's look at the group presentation, because we do presentations all the time. Here's the thing about presentations. They rarely are effective in assessing content, especially if the presentation is for a chunk of the content, and fine, it can work. But when we use presentations at the end for the final public product, which is good, it serves a good purpose that way. It just should not be the only assessment that we do at the end of a project at that point. So in a group presentation, let's just kind of look at how it usually looks like. Let's say you have a group of 4 students, and they're going to do usually like about a 10-minute presentation. That's what's in the box in the top left-hand corner. That's what normally happens in practice. So what happens logistically? How do students prepare, and how much time do they have in a presentation? Well, students usually divide the content into 4 parts. So each student is going to present one part. That makes sense, right? Just divide it up. So each one has a quarter of the content that they're going to address, so the concepts. And each person is responsible for giving a good presentation of that piece. And that's what they focus on. And in the best scenario, they have 2 minutes and 15 seconds to present on that one piece, that one quarter, assuming about 15 seconds of transition if we stay really tight to 10 minutes. So 15 seconds to switch over to the next person who's going to speak. So that's the logistics. That's how it usually works, right? Makes sense, how you organize it. So what's actually being assessed? Well, in the best case scenario, look on the right-hand side, the realistic assessment. What's being assessed first and foremost is the one part that the student presented on. So if I present on the first part, that's all I've shown you in the presentation, my understanding of the curriculum that you're assessing. I'm only showing you one quarter of what you're assessing in terms of my knowledge, concepts, and skills. And not only that, we go to B, we'll see that each person has only demonstrated potentially a deep understanding of just their part. So I've only demonstrated, if I've done the presentation well, I've only demonstrated a deep understanding of my part. I have not shown you a deep understanding of the other 3 parts, which is 75% of what's being assessed. And you don't know if I know it or not, because that wasn't the focus of my turn in presenting. So, and then the last thing, let's assume that I could talk about all 4 parts. Is it reasonable to think that I can show you a mastery level learning or a high level achievement of understanding in 2 minutes and 15 seconds for my turn to speak? Is that truly realistic? Probably not. I am a big advocate, a supporter of group presentations. I think they can be very effective and they can be very good at the end of a PBL unit or any other traditional unit. I just pose the question that by itself, it's not an adequate assessment of what students know, understand, and can do. It can't stand by itself. You have to have other assessments with it, traditional assessments or some other component where students can individually show understanding of the entirety of the skills and concepts that you expect them to know by the end of this. All right, let me pause there for a moment. I've thrown a lot at you at this point about assessment fog. What's a aha or wow, a new understanding that you have, or what's a question you have at this point? I'll give you 15 seconds to reflect and another 10 seconds to see posting before I continue. 15 seconds begins now. When you're ready, go ahead and post.
I've been doing online education for the past several months at the university, and I had even a bigger problem now. Now that everything's online, and we have group presentations there, and yeah, you got me thinking now.
Yeah, I said there's a place and value for a group presentation. So here's one way of addressing that: is have each person write a position paper about the topic in addition to the presentation. So now I have to show a deep understanding of the entirety of the big focus, even though I'm only presenting on one piece of it. I mean, that's one way of doing it. That's a way to keep it all real world with the assessments. Or if I want to do a mix of presentation and then traditional, then in addition to the presentation, I might have a traditional tests that they take either before the presentation or after. The reason I might do it before is because I want to make sure that they are fully prepared for the presentation by, studying and making sure they have full knowledge so they can make revisions to the presentation. Or I can do the test after the presentation, because then the presentations become like a review to hear everyone's presentations and then get some thinking about what gaps in knowledge they might have. So there's ways to resolve it. Okay. By American Cinema, I understood that students usually prepare to labs in chemistry, biology, and pairs. How effective is it? I think that individual reports will be equal. So there's value. I guess that's one place that the cinema is actually accurate. Not much is accurate, but that would be. Lots of times in the US, students work in pairs when they do lab work. Sometimes they work in larger groups too. So the intent is it sounds like you do labs. So as you know, when students are working in labs, it's good collaborative learning. We want them to practice and experience the role of the scientist who's doing experiments and understanding those steps. So they can work as groups there, and then the assessment comes later. I've seen science teachers who will set up labs as an assessment, where you have to go to each lab, look through the microscope, and make some analysis and judgments, do certain activities. And when they do those type of lab assessments, those are individual. Students are scheduled at certain times to rotate through the labs, so they all have that experience individually. But before then, they do work in groups because they can support each other and building understanding. That's the value of groups, is building understanding. It's just that sometimes we make a mistake from a logistical perspective, saying, oh, you know what, if I have them do all this work in groups, it's just easier to do a group grade. Well, just because it's easy doesn't mean it's efficient or effective. You know, the assessment should be separated from the learning experience, from the, you know, to use that time to practice and collaborate and grow in understanding so that they are ready for that individual task.
There's a comment about this. It says, so this means that assessment requires additional time.
Yeah, it can require additional time. There is ways to seamlessly put in. So for example, I give this example about the presentation because people use presentations. Presentations aren't the only way to do a final assessment that's for PBL. I mean, it can be a published essay or article. It could be a published video that students individually do. Or they might do it as a group and then they have to write a reflection piece, which like a test. Now, yes, if you add a traditional test or you add a reflection piece, that is something that is, I don't call it additional, I call it part of the package. What is your assessment package? And then plan that, because if our package is free of assessment fog, that saves you time in the long term. If our package is full of assessment fog, like this example I'm giving you, that means you've got unclear data, and that's going to create more problems for you and the students down the road, where you're going to have to spend more time cleaning up the data. So it might feel like more time up front. In the long term, it saves time.
And the comment is continued. However, we have a strict curriculum where the time is limited for each topic, for each.
Yeah, well, here's the thing though, you are the professionals. You are the professional teacher in the classroom who's working with learners, and that is your locus of control and influence. So there's two parts to that. One part is, then as the professional, look at your structure and then decide where to start first to build that in. The other part is, as all of us as professionals, if we want to continue to be seen as the professionals who understand, you know, what good learning looks like, we need to advocate and bring that to our administrators and say, I need to take more time in this unit. I can I can still get all the units done. And there'll be a different unit I need less time for. And I can make that adjustment, and here's why. Here's what I'm trying to do. Here's the assessments I'm making clear. And here's the outcome. See, we have to be specific. So remember at the very beginning, this is for all of you, when I asked you the question, how do you know if someone is listening? And I got good answers, but half the answers I pushed back on. They still were good answers. They just weren't specific enough. They addressed the broad idea. And if you go back to make changes in your curriculum, you have to give specific reasons and connections. And you are the professionals. You know what those are. Don't assume that your administrator or the person who makes that decision understands where you're coming from unless you are very specific. And that's the point about this assessment practices. We have to be specific in what we communicate to our students and what we collect from our students. All right, let's continue. Just kind of reflect on this, because we're going to go a little bit over our time, but I got space for that. So when we look at assessment in terms of making it clear, we need to make a distinction between academic and logistics, because part of the problem with assessment is, we saw in the example of the social studies activity I showed you at the very beginning, is that we tend to mix in logistics as part of the assessment, and that confuses things. So as you see here on the left-hand side, these are expectations are there, like it's typed or double space or whatever you expect. Those are important things to do. You know, that's what helps us produce professional products. And the ability to produce professional products in the workforce is very important. However, I challenge any of you to find a standard that includes this in your academic section. It's just not there. It's just not there. So if we're going to assess the logistics, then that's a separate category. I'm not saying you can't assess it. I'm not saying you can't coach them on it. You should. All I'm saying is don't put those points under the academic category because it creates an illusion. Because here's what can happen. It is quite possible for a student to follow directions, turn things in on time, have something neat, and follow your format expectations, get all the points for that, but show poor understanding of skills, concepts, and content or facts, and actually get a passing grade if you're including points for logistics. It is possible. I've seen it happen. So
can I share something, John?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a quite a recent example. So I got an A- for my master's thesis, and the minus was also because of the format. I had a few typos, and I guess there was an error in formatting one of the references, and yeah, I got a minus for that. So now I have an A- instead of A.
Yeah, and that steals something. It takes something away from the student. And I can tell you, I mentioned before, I'm a adjunct professor at an American university where I teach a graduate level class. And when I give assignments, I have two categories. One is academic and one's logistic. I take no points off for logistics. However, if a student does not follow the logistics that I've laid out clearly, I don't grade the paper. I give it back to them and tell them you need to complete those logistics and resubmit it. As a high school teacher, I did the same thing. And if I had students who I suspect would not do the work unless I was there, I had them meet with me during lunchtime. They would bring their lunch and they would eat their lunch so they didn't lose lunch. And they would work on the assignment until they got it done. In the virtual world, you can establish office hours. When there's students who aren't getting things done, then whenever your office hours are, they have to log in and sit there with you on camera and get that done. And that means they're losing free time to do other things, but so are you. So that you're both sharing the sacrifice and they're learning responsibility. And if you do that once or twice with a student, they'll start to follow your logistics expectations. Now, on the other side, if you just take points off for like you talk about Nurlan, if they take off points for spelling or some type of formatting error, and then they say, here, I lowered your grade. What most students in K-12 will say, like, okay, I don't care. I'm just going to move on to the next assignment. So they haven't learned anything. You haven't taught them anything. You let them off the hook by taking points off. Instead of, if this is really important to you, set up coaching time. And if you don't have the time to coach, then don't take points off, because taking points off does nothing to change the behavior. Does nothing. So we have to really, if there's something that we feel is important life skill, then we have to commit to teach and coach and have them reflect on it. We have to commit to that, and we can embed that into teaching curriculum. There are many ways of doing that. That's a whole different topic that I teach. But if we're not ready to commit to that, then let it go. Just let it go and focus on the academics. So when we focus on the academics, we have to be clear on our criteria. And we need to make sure that our criteria is qualitative expectations, not quantitative expectations. Because qualitative is what are the high quality we expect. Quantity is the amount of stuff we want them to do. So we do qualitative expectations with formative checkpoints. So we check, remember I said, we should be doing formative assessment checks at least once or twice a week, to really, in a formal way, to track their progress and growth and what they understand. This is important for PBL. This is important even for traditional units. So this is not something that's separate. We need to do that. And as we move forward with this, this is just, here's another example about presentations. So what you see here is on the left-hand side is what we should be assessing in a presentation. And what you see in the right hand tends to get mixed into that assessment. So on the left, you have address key concepts. Be accurate in your points of view. When you're like, so accurately contrast the points of view. Use accurate evidence to support ideas. Gosh, that one's so important. This is a piece like in social media. If students, I see so many people debating about topics, and they don't give evidence. They just make big statements, but they don't back them up. You helping them work on giving accurate evidence is a way to be clear about that. And then if they're using slide text or images, it accurately reflects, quote, the synthesis of the information. So it's not just it shows information, it actually supports and pushes forward the ideas being expressed. Whereas D is just logistics. Dress professionally, speak without notes, show enthusiasm, be prepared, know your content. Don't assess those. I mean, you can assess those, but don't put points to it. Make comments, but no points. Because the stuff on the left is what is clearly aligned or should be clearly aligned to assessing their knowledge and understanding of the academics. The stuff to the right is, if you include that, is assessment fraud. Just so you know, I have a couple of articles in your readings that talk about assessment fraud that you can explore, after this. So this is what we want to do. We want to focus on A, that's the academic. B, in a way it's expressed, these are qualitative expectations. Let's look at rubrics, because rubrics are some of the biggest offenders of assessment fraud. So I see so many rubrics that look like this. There are quantitative descriptors. They'll say, okay, this is just one example. It could be about evidence too. It's just, a 1 includes 1 or no images, a 2, you have 2 images, all the way to a 4 or more images to exceed standards. So is it possible, this is a rhetorical question, but is it possible for a student to have 4 images that have no relationship to the topic? And the answer is yes. And also the answer, and do they still deserve to get a 4? The answer is yes, because that's the contract. A rubric is a contract. If they do this and the pictures are unrelated, you still have to give them a 4 because they fulfill the language of this rubric, which is quantitative. I see things like has some, has most, has all. What does that mean? That's quantitative language. Yeah, enough. Yeah, these are language that by themselves are vague. They're broad. They say nothing. They don't address the academic. So here's an example of a revised version of the first one I showed you. This is all about images. So what you see in the black is what you would traditionally have in language. What you see in the red or brown is what we call the qualitative language that adds, emphasis about why it's a 2. So, for example, a 2 is some images may be present to support the message. But what does that mean? Well, other images do not, or there are insufficient images. 3, enough images are present and advance the message. That's very important. Advance it forward. And then it says in the brown, images act as supporting illustrations or details to the message. You see how the brown gives more specific, concrete, observable evidence so that students know what is expected of them. Here's a fun fact.
Can I ask a quick question? John?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. As a language arts teacher myself, and also recently, even the science teachers have been adopting this writing essays on particular topics as a kind of an assessment. And there is a criteria for the number of words, the minimum number of words in an essay. So what's your stance on this?
So that is a logistical requirement. So that means the way I look at it is if we're going to state, sometimes it's numbers, some words, sometimes it's number of pages, whatever it is. If they don't meet the minimum number, then give it back to them and say you need to add more. If there's a maximum number of words and they've gone over it, and give it back to them, tell them you need to revise, they need to cut it down. I mean, now you might have to coach them on that, which means you got to take time to do that. And if a teacher says, no, I don't have time to do that, then all right, then grade it as is. Do not give them, penalize them for missing that number. But here's the thing. So let's say hypothetically, so it's approximately usually about 250 to 300 words is equivalent to one typed double space page. And let's say they have to do 3,000 words. So that's about 10 pages. Okay, and so let's say that they only do 1,500 words. It is likely if they've really missed that number count by that much, that their level of content is just, they're not going to be able to get their point across. They're not going to be able to sufficiently express themselves. And so your academic rubric will still catch that problem because they'll be missing. Provide your academic rubric is clear on the descriptors like I have right here. Now, is it possible for a student to write and be concise and address the topic in half the amount of words than the normal student? Depending upon the rubric and the topic, yes, it is possible. So you have to use your judgment about that. As I said, when I am passionate about, like even in my grad class that I teach, I am passionate about students following through on my logistical requirements because I've carefully calibrated what is needed so that they can give me a high quality product. And I set my timelines so I have the space and the students have the space so that if they don't achieve it, those logistics, I can give it back to them and they have time to make those revisions. And in some case, even with grad students, I've had to do, it's all virtual, I teach them all online. I've actually had to set up phone calls and have coaching conversations to help them understand how to be better writers. But because I hold them to that standard, I have to meet and support them on that standard. Otherwise, I have to let it go.
There's a quick question in the comments.
Yeah.
So once you return the paper and the student augments his or her work, so after your feedback, what do you do next?
Well, sorry, I'm thinking so many implications to that question. So I'm just going to go with, I'm going to be true to myself. This is what I do, and I've done this for many years. So they resubmit the paper, and let's assume they resubmit the paper after the deadline when everyone else has turned in their papers. I will assess their paper and I take no points off because it's quote late. I take no points off because they had to go back and they needed more time to write. Because to me, that's part of differentiation. And what I care about is students having the ability to show their understanding of the content, to show their mastering and learning the content. Taking off points because something is late or something was given back to them creates assessment flaw. I need to know very cleanly and purely academically where are they at, because if they've got gaps academically, I have to know so that I can plan how I'm going to support and teach them. If they have, let's say they revise it and it's an A paper, it's 100%, but I drop it a letter grade to a B because it was late, or it was so late I drop it to a C. That's assessment flaw. Why are we punishing the kid and why are we making life difficult for ourselves? Because I'm going to come back 2 weeks later and look at that C. I'm not going to remember that they turned it in late. I'm going to see a C and say, oh, they've got gaps in their learning, so I need to do some extra teaching. When the reality is they don't need the extra teaching. Again, there are schools that do assess following directions and being professional. And when they do assess that, it's a separate category that students get data for, so that if you're tracking the ability to follow directions, which might include punctuality and getting things turned in on time, now you can actually coach them on that. You have a column that you are addressing about that. Some schools don't include that as part of their academic grade. Other schools that do, will say, for example, okay, 8%, like my kids went to a high school, PBL high school, where 8% of their total grade was for collaboration, and another 8% was on communication. That means 84% of their grade was academic, and 16% was those two skills. And it was not assessment fog because they were separate categories. There are times I actually had, the times I had conversations with teachers about my daughter's work, she does really good work, was around, in high school, was around because she sometimes got low scores in collaboration. And I would want to understand what was going on because I knew her academics were strong. I mean, what I found out was her collaboration was strong too. It's just that the teacher was using that category differently than what the rubrics said. So those things are important. And so the other thing I want to say about rubrics is this. So I have this for you. This is a rubric on rubrics that you can use to evaluate your rubrics. You know, look at your rubrics, look and see what type of language do you have. Look at how you show the criteria. Look how are you using parallel language so that each column builds off the next one, like we see here. There's parallel language about in the black. The black part's parallel, kind of builds off the previous one, and then the red is the adding context for clarity. So those are things that are really important when you do assessment fog. All right. So we're a little bit over our time, but you know, when we think about, you know, these are things I want you to think about. I want to give you a chance. I'd like you to reflect and share. What is your response as far as what area do you want to spend more time thinking about? Not that you're not doing it, but you want to spend more time thinking about. Is it academics or logistics? Is it qualitative or quantitative? Or is it about rubric descriptors? Oh, let me share one last thing about rubrics. I always ask this question: what is the primary purpose of rubrics? If your answer is the primary purpose of rubrics is to grade students or to show students, I mean, that's incorrect. We can definitely use rubrics to assess for grades, but the primary purpose of rubrics is to help students evaluate their own work as they're creating it, so they can track their growth. So that's an important thing to know. Okay, so I see people already posting their answer to 1, 2, and 3.
And while the participants are posting their ideas, there's a nice question. It's not about assessment, but it's about PBL in general, I guess. It says, do you ever make changes to your initial plan, such as the deadlines or even the members of the groups of students and so on?
Well, yeah, always. I mean, just like in a traditional unit, you would make adjustments. A unit is great, can be the best unit you've ever designed. You can feel like, wow, this is perfect. It's an amazing unit. And it stays amazing until you have to involve students. But as soon as you implement it, you have to make adjustments. Now, when it comes to timelines, like for the final presentation or the authentic connection with an audience, sometimes those will move. Sometimes a lot of times those do not move, because if I schedule a time where experts are participating, I can't ask experts to reschedule because they have their own busy schedule. They're giving me, if they say they can help me on Friday of the 3rd week, and I got some of my students aren't ready to do the presentation, then the students who are ready will present. The students who are not ready will not present, but they will present to me the following week because the show must go on. And that just means they lose that rich opportunity to have voice. Now they have to attend the presentations of the others. I can tell you, I've heard this from teachers, I've seen it myself, the ones who did not get to present because they weren't ready and they see what happens, they really wish they had gotten ready. That motivates them for the next project.
Thank you.
All right, so here's one last thing I want to share with you guys. And that is, because this leads into our next topic tomorrow, which is about managing the project. But this is an assessment piece, so that's why I have it here. is that, you know, the other challenge is having students have a schedule to follow to complete their work. And so it's really important when students, and it's also true even in virtual, non-PBL, is that if students don't magically know how to organize their time, some do, but some don't. So if this is an example where you create a schedule, where you look at the number of tasks that need to happen, and you give them a table like this, where the second column is how much time you think it'll take to do, you give them the due dates, and then students fill in the first column. Like they fill in their start date and time for when they're going to do the work, and then they check off on the far right column when they got it done. So even if they check off and it's not really done, you, the teacher, can then have a coaching conversation with them. But this gives them a way to organize their time. Some of your students don't need this. They're going to be just fine. But having something like this you give to the team can be really helpful for the team to organize their time and think about how they move forward. The other piece is when you give them a list like this can be really overwhelming. I mean, there's 8 things here. I've seen students who just feel stuck when they look at a list, even though they can do it. All right, I got about 5 minutes for any other questions that you may have. Nurlan, are there any questions that are being asked?
There is one question for the organizers, so it's not to us, but I'll still address it a little later. So there are some comments like, yeah, we do have some problems with assessment, and I totally agree with this. So just to give you the context, John, our country has been under undergoing some major reforms in education, and one of them is the assessment reform, which goes under a bigger reform called an updated curriculum reform. And in that updated curriculum, this whole idea of updated curriculum is to shift towards functional literacy, to get students more ready for the assessment, like a PISA assessment, and so on. And the big part of it is assessment, criteria-based assessment. And I know I talk a lot to my colleagues, and I know we all have problems with assessment because right now, currently, many teachers are shifting from the I need to turn my camera on for this one, from the old traditional assessment system from 1 to 5, where we used to just grade 1 to 5, and now we're shifting towards the criteria-based assessment. However, this whole change was done too quickly for many teachers, and now I'm talking for myself, but many teachers had this, like, I'm using criteria-based assessment, but in my head I'm still thinking 1 to 5 system. You know, so we had this problem. We have to admit this, and this whole assessment topic always gets us into lots of debates and arguments with teachers whenever we touch this sensitive topic.
Yeah, I mean, we just spent an hour and 20 minutes on this topic. I have done entire day workshops on this topic. So I try. I mean, yeah, because there's so much to it, and I like the fact that you're going to criteria assessment, and there are so many. There are different tools that can really support that within that. So, okay. Well,
so no further questions so far. So thank you very much, John.
Okay. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. See you tomorrow.